One of the biggest problems for Muslims is the spiritual reliability of Muhammad. Some of the descriptions of Muhammad receiving revelation sound like something straight out of The Exorcist. Apart from that, there are a number of details in the Muslim sources that seriously call into question Muhammad's spiritual reliability. We know from Muslim records that when Muhammad began receiving revelations, his first impression was that he was demon-possessed. We know that after his experience in the cave, he became suicidal, tried to hurl himself off a cliff. We know that it was his wife Khadija and her cousin Waraka who persuaded him that he wasn't possessed, he was a prophet of God. Now, what happened to Muhammad in the cave when the Quran started coming to him? I don't know. But I know this, when he ran out of that cave, terrified, depressed, and suicidal, he was convinced that he had seen a demon. And that's a problem. And there are other problems. Think about the satanic verses, the verses that Muhammad delivered to his followers and later claimed were from Satan. When Muhammad, this is how the story goes, when Muhammad was preaching in Mecca, he didn't win very many converts, but he wanted his countrymen to accept Islam, and he was hoping to receive a revelation that would help them. And then one day, of course, he got the revelation he was looking for. It said, "Have you not heard of Alat and Alusa and Manat, the third, the other? These are the exalted cranes whose intercession is to be hoped for." So there are these three goddesses that are like birds. They're exalted cranes who can carry your prayers to Allah. This was originally part of Surah 53 of the Quran. Muhammad delivered these verses to his followers. He bowed down in honor of them, and his followers bowed down with him. But a little while later, Muhammad told his followers that these verses, which he had delivered as part of the Quran, weren't really from God, they were from Satan. And he replaced them with the words that we find in the Quran today. So when you read Surah 53, keep in mind the fact that it originally promoted polytheism and that Muhammad couldn't tell the difference between a revelation from God and a revelation from Satan. It's also interesting to note that at one point late in life, Muhammad was a victim of a magic spell, according to him, not according to me. Several passages in Bukhari report that someone stole a hairbrush from Muhammad and used it to cast a spell on him. Ibn Ishaq tells us that Muhammad was bewitched during this time, and Bukhari adds that the spell made him delusional. So according to Muslim sources, God's greatest prophet was under a spell for, let's say, a year. And that's a problem. And so we look at the historical records and we find that Muhammad originally thought he was demon-possessed. He became suicidal when he started receiving his revelations. He delivered verses from Satan, and people could cast spells on him. And Muslims, a lot of Muslims don't know anything about this, but even if you point it out, they say, it's no big deal. But I look at it and say, maybe there's something wrong here. Muhammad is a man who had sex with a 9-year-old girl. He married more women than his own revelations allowed. He married the wife of his own adopted son. He had sex with his slave girls. He supported idolatrous pagan practices like kissing the black stone and bowing down to the Kaaba. He assassinated people for criticizing his religion. He executed people for making fun of him. He beheaded hundreds of Jews for trying to defend themselves once they realized he was eliminating them. Muhammad started a war with Mecca when he had a chance to live in peace in Medina. He enslaved thousands of people. He allowed his followers to rape their female captives and occasionally took the most beautiful captive back to his own tent. He told his followers that it's okay to beat their wives into submission. He certainly hit Aisha. Muhammad told his followers that women are stupid and that their testimony is unreliable. He tortured people for money. He supported his religion by robbing people. He preached a message of violence and cruelty, and he taught his followers to believe in a God who loves only them and no one else. This is the ideal pattern of conduct, according to chapter 33, verse 21 of the Quran. When we study jihad, the most important thing to keep in mind is that jihad proceeds in stages, and there are three main stages that we could break down. Stage one applies when Muslims are completely outnumbered. They can't hope to win a physical confrontation with unbelievers, Muslims are taught to proclaim a message of peace and tolerance. And chapter 109 of the Quran is a good passage to study in light of this. It commands Muslims that if someone disagrees with them, you say, to you be your religion and to me be my religion. Very peaceful. But that's only under those circumstances. When Muslims can fight, when they can fight unbelievers but aren't in a position to subjugate those unbelievers, here we have stage 2. And in this case, Muslims are to engage in defensive jihad. They're allowed to fight, and they have to fight if they're being attacked or persecuted, or if people are making fun of Islam, something like that. Muslims are to fight, but the unbeliever has to do something. It has to be some sort of provocation. But that isn't the end of the story. There's also stage 3, when Muslims are in the majority. They're commanded to fight offensive jihad. And the most important verse for Christians here would be chapter 9, verse 29 of the Quran. It says, fight those who do not believe in Allah. And it specifically refers to Jews and Christians. It commands Muslims to violently subjugate us until we pay the jizya, until we pay tribute money to Muslims. So this offensive jihad stage is what is commonly denied by Muslims in the West, but it was certainly present. It's present in the Quran, it was present in the life of Muhammad, and it's been present in Islam for 14 centuries. And we're seeing the ramifications even today. One of the most popular Muslim arguments is the scientific accuracy of the Quran. The claim here is that Muhammad revealed things that couldn't have been known during his time, and this is just nonsense. The Quran is a scientific catastrophe. Chapter 1886 of the Quran says that the sun sets in a muddy pool. 86, 6 through 7 say that semen is formed between the backbone and the ribs. 88:20 says that the earth is flat. 65:12 says that there are 7 earths. 36:38 to 40 say that the sun orbits the earth. 22:5 says that human embryos go through a blood clot stage. 22:65 says that the sky would fall on the earth if Allah didn't hold it up. 37:6 through 10 and 67:5 declare that stars are missiles that God uses to shoot demons who try to sneak into heaven. And Muslims look at all of this and then they tell us that the Quran is known to be true because of the scientific miracles in it. And I just want to know, what did Muhammad say that an average person walking around wouldn't have known? Everything else beyond that, he got wrong. He got everything that he could possibly get wrong. He got wrong. The Quran is also filled with historical errors, and we find these things over and over again when we read the Quran. The pattern is Muhammad tells a story, and we can trace the story back to some kind of forgery or some other historically inaccurate account. And a funny example is it has to do with something Muhammad said about Abraham. Basically in the Bible, Genesis 15, we're told that God called Abraham out of Ur of the Chaldeans. In the Babylonian language, Ur means city, so it's the city of the Chaldeans. But in the first century, a Jewish rabbi named Jonathan ben Uziel was translating Genesis 15 into Aramaic, and he came across the word Ur. He didn't know how to speak Babylonian, so he confused the Babylonian word Ur, which means city, with the Hebrew word Ur, which means fire. And this mistake caused him to mistranslate the passage. Instead of saying that God delivered Abraham out of Ur of the Chaldeans, Jonathan's mistranslation said that God delivered Abraham out of the fire of the Chaldeans. Now, why is this important? Well, Jewish writers ran with this idea of Abraham escaping the fire. And so the Talmud eventually contains stories in which Abraham was thrown into a fire by the Chaldeans and was miraculously rescued by God. These stories were popular in Arabia during the time of Muhammad, which is crucial because in the Quran, Surah 21, we read about Abraham being delivered from the fire. Now, Muhammad claimed that he got this story from God, but we know that the story of Abraham being delivered from the fire was based on a mistranslation of the word Ur. So what makes more sense here? That God also mistranslated the word Ur, or that Muhammad was getting some of his stories from the people around him? This is why it's not surprising to read in chapter 25, verse 5 of the Quran, that Muhammad's contemporaries were accusing him of copying various tales in the Quran from earlier writers. Lots of Muslims hear about Christians talking about being saved through the sacrifice of Jesus as problematic, or as if there's something unjust about it. How could God punish one man for the sins of others? And there are Quranic passages that they get this from. So chapter 6, verse 164, for instance, is one of the passages where the Quran says that no bearer of burden shall bear the burden of another. Muslims say, you see there, no bearer of burden, no one who bears a burden, is going to bear someone else's burden. So each person has to pay for his own sins. The Quran is just, Christianity is unjust. Now, there are a couple of problems here. One, the Quran isn't consistent on this point. So chapter 16, verses 22 through 25 say that some people will bear the burdens of others. And in chapter 29, verses 12 to 13, it's even more interesting because the Quran contradicts itself in the space of two verses. Verse 12 says that no one will bear the burden of others, and the very next verse says that some people will bear the burdens of others. So the Quran leaves it open that some people will bear the burdens of others. And here the burden, of course, is burden of sin. So Muhammad expands on this in the Hadith, Sahih Muslim 66:65 through 66:68. You have several passages where Muhammad declares that Muslims with sins as heavy as a mountain will approach on Judgment Day, and Allah will take their sins and put them on the backs of Jews and Christians. So Jews and Christians, according to Muhammad, will be punished in hell for the sins of Muslims. Allah is going to take away the sins heavy as a mountain from the Muslims and put them on the Christians. And here it's just interesting because Muslims condemn Christianity. It's unjust for Allah to punish Jesus for the sins of Muslims when that's what Muhammad said. But Muslims don't know it because they don't read their sources. That's why we have to tell them. So according to Muhammad, Allah will punish other people for the sins of Muslims. So if it's unjust, why isn't Muhammad a false prophet? But there's one more interesting thing here that needs to be noted. Notice what the Quran says. So in other words, if we just toss out the fact that the Quran contradicts itself on this point, and if we throw out all of the hadith where Muhammad declares that Jews and Christians will be punished for the sins of Muslims, if we just focus on the passages that Muslims want to bring up, namely, no bearer of burden shall bear the burden of another. Even in these passages, notice what they say. They don't say, no one can bear the burden of another. They say, no bearer of burden shall bear the burden of another. In other words, no one who already has a burden of sin can bear the burdens of others. Why? Because you have to answer to God for your own sins. You can't go taking away the sins of other people. Well, what would this leave open? This would leave open the idea of someone who has no sin being able to bear the burdens of others because he has no burden on his own. And so, according to Islam, there's only one person ever who was sinless, and that's Jesus. And so the message of Christianity and Islam can be compared like this. According to Christianity, the one person who could ever bear the burdens of others did it. And the message of Islam is that the one person who could ever bear the burdens of others didn't do it. And yet they claim that they have a superior view of Jesus.